So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the second speaker, Bob Fryer. Bob Fryer was Chief Learning Advisor to the Department of Health in UK until 2008. He was previously National Director for Widening Participation in Learning at the Department, responsible for strategy to open up access to learning and employment in the National Health Service. Bob was Assistant Vice Chancellor at the University of Southampton and Director of New College. He was Principal of the Norton College of Residential Adult Education for 15 years, and he is Chair of the Board of Campaign for Learning and was one of the Campaign for Learning founding trustees. The keynote speech is entitled Learning, Knowledge and Wisdom for All in Late Modernity. Bob, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And may I begin by saying I'm very conscious that we've been sitting here for a long time already. I often find conferences are a wonderful contradiction. Speakers like myself talk a lot about the importance of dialogue, of communication, of participation, of engagement and exchange, and then we stand up and talk at you for a long time. We've got to work through these contradictions and find better ways, I think. So I'm going to dash through this presentation as quickly as I can and hope that you'll follow it up by looking on the website subsequently. In fact, even the presentation itself has got a main core of stuff and then some additional material. So here's my agenda. I just want really to look at these things. What kind of world are we living in? I find it quite difficult talking to policymakers, to educationalists, to strategists, to enthusiasts in particular, who want quickly to move towards curriculum, technique, technology, skill, and so on, without really thinking about what kind of a world this curriculum, this technology, this skill and so forth is supposed to prepare people for. I want to talk really about one of the enduring contradictions of all learning, and particularly of formal education. That is, that it actually endorses and legitimizes inequality. Actually, it's one of the uncriticized notions of education that we end up with those who succeed and those that don't. So I want to ask the big question today: what kinds of learning and what kinds of learners have a chance of thriving in this emergent world, and perhaps what will not? What kind of learning will not give people that chance? I end then very briefly by asking about how new technologies can help this challenge, and I give an example from a European-funded project in which I'm involved with some colleagues who are here, and we'll speak more about this on Saturday morning, of using the web and Web 2 in particular. So what kind of a world is it? Well, the world we live in has got one single characteristic, manifests itself differently in different countries, but above all, it's a world which is typified by change in almost every organizational, institutional, personal, social, cultural, economic domain in which we live. If you each think about your own country, I see we have a largest delegation from China where this applies most, but some of the older European economies like Belgium and the UK have this. If you think about it, and think about the last 30 years, we've probably got an age range in this very audience of about 40 years. If you think about the last 30 years, almost every aspect of your human experience in your country in different ways has come in for change. Changes in jobs, in occupations, in family life, in patterns of relationships, in expectations, in orientations, the very food we eat, the way we travel, the manner of communication, the kinds of technology that are available. All of this kind of change is ubiquitous. It's around us everywhere. It manifests itself with highlights in different ways for different groups in different countries. But I visited maybe 20 countries in the last 15 years, particularly while I've been involved with government policy in the UK, and this resonates with them all, that they want to know, how do we deal with change? One of the big changes that we need to learn about is that actually, after about 100 years, particularly in Europe, but not exclusively so, in other parts of the world, in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, to a lesser extent in parts of Africa and India and China, for about 100 years, the big differentials between those who have and those who have not, those who have power, those who don't, those who have wealth, those that don't, those that have high incomes and those that don't, those who are included and those who are excluded, for about 100 years, under the joint influence of welfare policies and initiatives taken by states and governments, with employers either willingly or very often under statutory requirement taking greater care of their staff, and the big impact, I'm sad to say, of World War, we saw a narrowing of those differentials. So the differentials of income and of power and of wealth and of involvement in society began to be narrowed. Now, don't get me wrong, they didn't get eliminated altogether, but they narrowed for about 100 years. That is until the onset, over the last 30 years, of neoclassical thinking, of the neoliberalism which has come to dominate global politics. And what's been happening in the last 30 years, and it's happening very fast in some countries, and again, I do a lot of visits to China, talk to my Chinese colleagues, vastly so in China and India and in all of the emergent economies, Brazil and so on. Actually, the differentials now are rapidly widening. The challenge, actually, to anybody interested, and I really enjoyed your presentation from the Commission, interested in getting some notion of equality back on the agenda, is bigger now than it was when I began my university career back in the mid-1960s. So we have a great deal of social fragmentation along the lines of class and race and gender and nationhood. And many of these fragmentations are very, very serious for those of us interested in education. And yet, on the other hand, we see an interesting phenomenon. And again, isn't this crazy how this occurs in so many different places, often unpredictably, as, for example, in the so-called emergence in North Africa last year and the year before of a press for democratization. We have people expressing their political involvement at a time where in many places formal participation in politics, voting, membership of parties and so on is in decline, and there have been many European Union reports on this. Actually, people are creating new spaces for their democratic selves. And one of the most important new spaces, of course, is the web. And we've seen how important the web has been in advancing people's political ambitions. So curiously, we have a world which is full of change, full of contradictions, widening of differentials, and yet there is some optimism around. And many of you will be familiar with this work that Ulrich Beck originally pioneered in the mid-1990s, a German social philosopher who worked in the UK for a long time. And Ulrich asked himself this difficult question: how would you characterize the emergent modern world, the late modern world? And he characterized it as risk society. And risk society is characterized by these features on this little diagram. Not only change, but change coupled with uncertainty, with unpredictability, with unsustainability. It's a world in which even science becomes deeply contested. It's a world of unreliability in many respects. It's a world in which, actually, unless you know how to break the rules, cross the boundaries, blur the distinctions, it will be very, very difficult to survive. Some of you will have seen me adding this slide this morning, because coming over on the plane yesterday, I was reading the Financial Times. And even the Financial Times, I've got it here if anybody wants to have a look at the article. This is an article by Gillian Tett, who did a brilliant analysis, by the way, of the financial crisis of 2008, writing in the heart of the city of London, writing in one of the newspapers, which is one of the 2 or 3 worldwide read newspapers for financiers, is now saying, actually, we've been paying attention to the wrong things. This is a new age. She uses the language of volatility, not at all different from Beck's notion of risk. This is an era in which we now need to attend to some much more difficult and elusive and non-quantitative aspects of society. And she gives the 3 political values: social cohesion and civic identity. This is a very different world, this world of risk society, of uncertainty, unpredictability, unreliability, the blurring or elimination of organisational boundaries. And yet in this world, as I hinted earlier, there is a central contradiction. And here is the contradiction. I'll put it in the red letters on each thing. While learning is engaging for some, and I guess that includes most of us here, if not all of us, it's a nightmare for many other people. Even the very language of learning and education and teaching is viewed and experienced negatively. Sometimes this is attributed to people's early experience of learning at school or what happened to them at the hands of school teachers, but it's not exclusively there. You see, what learning does, it distributes failure as much as achievement. In fact, it distributes failure better than it distributes achievement. It rewards the successful but punishes those who don't succeed in terms of their life chances. It mostly, but increasingly not so much, it mostly leads, if you get good education and good qualification, to good jobs. But actually for others, and I think the other group is still a very large group, look around you at who does the jobs of drudgery. Low paid, low skilled, low autonomy, no prospects. Estimated by some to still be about 30 or 40% of the working population of the most advanced economies in the world. For some, learning and achievement represents the beginning of a lifetime of excitement, engagement, involvement, stimulation, pleasure. But for most, it leads to a lifetime of exclusion from learning. And, of course, learning is beset by the divisions, one of which we're here discussing now, the division of age, but the social divisions which beset education so that it becomes not simply the site of their manifestation, but education becomes the locale for its legitimation. Legitimation of divisions of class and race, ethnicity, gender, disability, region, religion and identity. It's not simply that we find and see these divisions in the world of education, it's that actually some of the outputs of the world of education endorse these very divisions. Just give you one example of where we're at, and I've just used my own country because I've just looked at the latest data. The A, B, C1, C2, D, E are the social classes. At the top, the A, B, you've got the owners, the senior managers, the chief executives, the high-quality professionals. And in the DE, you've got unskilled, semi-skilled, long-term unemployed, excluded. And you can see over a period which in my country has been dominated by cries from politicians for lifelong learning for everyone, indeed from the EU for lifelong learning for everyone. Many of us remember the brilliant report that Jacques Delors did for the UNESCO inquiry, The Treasure Within, all about the hidden treasures that we all have. And yet what this little piece of data shows, and this is replicated in most European countries, even in those which have got a more egalitarian system of education than the UK, such as Finland and Denmark, this pattern is persistent. Those who are involved in post-school learning tend to be those that were well qualified in initial education and have got the best jobs, the highest paid jobs, the jobs with the most autonomy, the jobs with the most choice, the jobs with the most prospects. So they are involved in learning, have been involved in the last 3 years, expect to be involved, Whereas the people who are the labourers, the semi-skilled workers, the people that will be fixing our bedrooms while we're here today, cleaning the streets, driving the lorries, who will be looking after all the manifold things that so-called civilized society wants, they're the least involved. They've been less involved in the past. They expect to be less involved in the future. Just to give the example of age participation in learning, the National Institute of Adult Continuing Education in the UK, which I'm a board member of, does a very, very well-regarded survey every year of people's involvement in learning. And they use the most inclusive notion of learning. It can be formal, informal, non-formal. It can be done from books, off the television, in small groups, or it can be done in the most formalised institutional settings. And you can see those that say they have been or are involved in learning in the last 3 years, how it dramatically declines from the young people who are mostly still in obligatory education, or those involved in higher education subsequently, how that dramatically declines over the years. What is it that's going on that makes people not want to be involved in learning? Well, what can you do about this? There are two kinds of solution, I guess. There are those which are favoured by the likes of us, which are educational solutions, and are often favoured, by the way, by politicians and policymakers, because they believe sincerely, and I have to accept that it is sincerity, that all you need to do is to change those institutions that are responsible for sponsoring learning. Abolish them, reform them, reorganise them, diversify them, do what you will, but the problem is the institutions. Get rid of the head teachers, change the leadership, have more informal community-based learning centres. There must be something we can do to change the institutional map. Well, the institutional map has been changed so many times in the last 30 years, I wonder that we can tolerate any more change in the institutions, because it doesn't work. So you can provide additional resources to those who are deprived or excluded. Things like you might give them return to learn schemes or access schemes, or you might put community workers in, or you might put more money in. Well, it doesn't seem to make much difference. Oh, okay, then we'll have a thing that I was responsible for in the UK, in the National Health Service, the biggest employer in Europe, 1.3 million. Let's widen participation. Let's give many more opportunities to people. Even after long periods of injection of widening participation initiatives in the UK and in other European countries, the pattern of involvement in learning hardly shifts. In fact, the interesting thing is, most initiatives to widen participation benefit mostly those who are already involved. This is a remarkable phenomenon. Okay, they say that's what. Maybe the curriculum isn't interesting enough, not challenging enough. Maybe we could somehow modify the curriculum. And if we play with the curriculum, suddenly people will become involved. Well, you don't need me to tell you that many modifications of the curriculum make little or no difference. Sometimes it actually makes things worse. Okay, they say, maybe we're measuring the wrong thing. Maybe we've got too narrow a conception of learning. Maybe we've got to measure it differently. Maybe there is some other kind of way of capturing what's going on that will be better. Well, I have some sympathy with that view, but so far we've found it very difficult to capture some kinds of learning in valid ways. Okay, they say, well, let's value more forms and modes and locales of style of learning. Let's realise that the narrow focus on traditional academic ways of measuring learning outcomes suits a minority of people, but we need to look at other forms. Or we can say, and lots of the work at this conference, some wonderfully interesting papers and workshops coming up. I'm spoiled for choice. Let's change or enrich the pedagogy, very often by using new techniques, new technologies, and so forth. Well, that's where we mostly lie, those of us in this room, although some of us may have another life, or a life that we yearn for, when actually we realise that the real problem is structural, and you need some kind of social or political solutions of redistribution of wealth and income, of status, and perhaps most of all of power. Maybe we need really powerful positive action programs, maybe even, some will argue, reverse discrimination, which makes the educators shudder normally because they think somehow standards are going to be dropped. Or a big obsession in my country, can we enhance social mobility? Personally, I'm not particularly committed to the idea that's a real social or political solution because it leaves the structures of inequality in place but allows some people, like myself, I'm a good example of it, to escape. Well, we have to remember, of course, that what we mean by learning, knowledge and wisdom are all deeply contested areas of work. The idea that there's somehow an agreement on what we mean by learning, knowledge and wisdom is mythical. Learning does occur in a variety of ways, in many different locales, in many different modes, for very many different purposes, and it's funded and supported in many, many different ways. So when we have a conversation about learning, we need to locate it in those variables, because a simple, homogeneous conception of learning won't give you enough insight to what the challenge and problem is. What kind of learning? How is it being done? What methods and modes are being used? Who's involved? Who isn't? What's the purpose of this particular kind of learning? How is it supported and funded? Similarly, the sources and generation and transmission of of knowledge, the whole notion of epistemology, is a deeply, deeply divided field. In fact, one of the sadnesses for myself as an educationist, if you look back to 100 years ago, when Dewey was writing some of the most formative, actually debates about the nature of knowledge and its origins have been very, very thin. Now we're in an opportunity, as we heard from the Commission earlier, to think about new ways of generating wisdom and knowledge through collaborative systems of learning. And that will present us with problems as well as opportunities. So what I'm saying is, in this world of change, of vicissitude, of risk, of unpredictability, we have great inequalities in learning, and as well as distributing benefits to people, learning somehow endorses the inequalities. And then if we add to that the complexity of what we mean by knowledge and learning and wisdom, we are in a very, very challenging and difficult domain. And I would commend to Eden that it incorporates debate about these things in its considerations of learning solutions. This is a little framework that I've worked out for myself, that if you draw a little 2x2 diagram, it's very crude and very simple, from formal learning down to the most informal and non-formal learning, and you move from the kind of welfarist, collectivist approach to learning, which still is characteristic, despite some changes, of, say, Nordic countries, or you come to places like the UK or New Zealand or United States of America, and increasingly over the last 5 years to France, towards the neoliberal position. You get these very different conceptions of learning. Are we up in this top, does the pointer work? I can't see it moving. Yeah, are we up in this top quadrant here? Oh, I've got to go back. Are we up in this top quadrant here of highly formal learning, which is publicly funded, where we look at institutions, where the notion of citizenship matters and we're interested in inclusivity, or say, are we down in this bottom quadrant down here, where learning is becoming increasingly privatized, it's more voluntary and community, it's all about non-institutional settings. What I'm trying to do through this diagram is to say, this is me beginning to drill down into one of those areas which I said is contested. What kind of learning, for what kind of people, with what sorts of purposes, in what kind of locales, and in what ways is it funded? And again, we often talk as if these four quadrants are the same. But if we're in the upper quadrants talking about formal learning, or in the lower quadrants talking about informal learning, it's very, very different. If you look around the world in the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 10 or so, you can see that we've got an emergent model of learning where we move from the blue column of the more traditional forms of schools and colleges and universities and training centres, from learning which mostly occurs in the early years of life up to about 25, which is very much delivered by the teacher as a knowing person, often face-to-face, often a very expert professional curriculum and so on. We seem to be moving towards the emergent view of learning, where learning is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, work, home, community, on the move with your mobile phone, increasingly learner-centred. It's very often delivered through some distance or e-form. Often now we're talking about the joint production of curricula. Perhaps for the first time, a wider discussion about what is really meant by joint or collaborative developed knowledge and skills. It's a much more reflective approach to learning, much more constructivist. A friend of mine recently finished her PhD thesis. She comes from China, from the what was then called the China Radio TV University. My Chinese colleagues here will be interested. And what she saw was actually Chinese students, more than Chinese teachers and faculty, clinging to the blue side, when what the faculty in the universities and the government was trying to do was move people to the red side of this diagram. I found that quite fascinating, that in fact it was the students that were more conservative than the teachers. You see, what I think we need for the 21st century, for this emergent world of risk, for this world dominated by educational and social divisions, for this world in which wisdom and knowledge and learning are contested, is we need two different kinds of ways of being, two different mentalities. And I've got another great long presentation on this. If any of you have got an evening when you can't get to sleep, I could give it to you. It's how can we reconcile Max Weber, the great prophet of predictability, reliability,